In a post-World War II world, France has been turned into a punchline. Their flag, a once bold combination of red, white, and blue bars, turned into a white flag of surrender. That really isn't the whole story, though. A key part of the rich and forgotten history is a man who has been enveloped by a mystery, all to himself. Today, we will be talking about one of history's most storied men, and that, friends, is Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's story isn't your typical rags to riches, but it does involve one man refusing to settle for his lot in life and having high opinions of himself. He was cunning, manipulative, and forever guided by his quote-unquote lucky star, which made one of the most prolific military campaigners in history. All of that today on another episode of The Remedial Scholar.
That's ancient history.
I feel I was denied critical, need to know information.
Belongs in a museum, bro.
Stop skipping your remedial class.
Welcome back, everyone, to The Remedial Scholar. I am your host, Levi. If you're new, thank you for joining us. What a lovely presence you bring. Before we get into the mythical mini madman known as Napoleon, a few things to go over. Thank you for your reviews, ratings on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podchaser, anywhere else you can review us. They help out for people who don't already listen to the show to find it. If you really want to help people who don't listen to the show find it, share us wherever possible. Of course, the merch is always available in the description of this episode, and all the other links are in the description as well. The last thing before we get to Napoleon, there's also a tip button in the link tree or the Captivate sites. All of those you can find through the description itself. Those go towards things like hosting fees for the show, so I'm able to distribute them in a professional way. So think of that as a donation, if you will. Okay, enough of the politicking and begging. On to Napoleon. This show is going to be pretty straightforward, following the biographical timeline of Napoleon and his background before diving into his military conquests and then getting into the major campaigns and what those led to. Sound good? Perfect. Let's get into it. Napoleon Bonaparte was born Napoleon Bonaparte on August 15th, 1769 in the city of Ajaccio on the island of Corsica. Corsica was under Italian rule during this period, but had just been annexed by the French the previous year. The Bonaparte family was of Italian origin and of the minor gentry, meaning that at the time they were of modest means, but still had a little bit of influence on the island. Napoleon's father, Carlo Maria Bonaparte. That's how I gotta pronounce it. Otherwise, I'm not gonna figure it out. They were Italian, right? So I can do a bad Italian accent. Anyway, Carlo was a gambling man who was reckless with the family money, who descended from a family of Tuscan nobles. Those nobles would be from the Tuscany region of Italy, obviously. Napoleon also had 11 siblings. His mother, Maria Letizia Romolino, who was married at the age of 14, was described as an austere and courageous woman. I wonder why. That's 11 kids. That's insane now. If I met somebody who has 11 kids in this day and age, I would be bewildered by their tenacity, is one way to say it. But then also, back then, when medicine was not the greatest, that's impressive. Anyway, the Bonapartes had been allied with the Italian side of the Corsican conflict, meaning that they were initially against the French occupation of the island. However, in a bid for survival, they shifted outward allegiance. You see, at the time, the French observed a strategy of integration when they occupied a territory, or at least when it came to the taking of Corsica. As such, families like the Bonapartes would be, hard-pressed not to naturalize. To do so, many of these families sent their young boys out to mainland France to receive their education. Napoleon was of no exception. At the age of 9, he was sent to a religious school in the French mainland. At the age of 10, Napoleon learned how to speak French. During his formative years, he was rumored to have been bullied for his accent, stature, manners, and also short height. Granted, he was a child, but this is a good moment to segue into a common misconception that Napoleon was in fact not a short king. By the time he was 18 years old, he was around 5'6". For an 18th century man, pretty average, pretty standard. Sorry, haters. Know what you want. The idea that Napoleon was a short man was actually most likely originated by British propagandists who sought to discredit him during his rapid rise to power. Also, another notable mention here is the fact that some historical texts attribute his childhood bullying to have been a contributing factor to his desire to constantly improve himself. Also, I have read that there was also just a difference in how they measured people. Like, the French measured people using one system that was, like, way different than the way the English measured people. And the English saw the numbers and assumed it was in their measurement. And so they're like, dude, this guy is fucking tiny. Like, dude, this guy is tiny. And then you got to put in the fact that when they saw him on the battlefield, he's probably pretty far away. And that means he's just a little bitty guy. Just kidding. That's silly. But... Anyway, in 1785, at the age of 16, Napoleon, who was an avid reader and displayed interest in the sciences, got a scholarship to a military academy, École Militaire, in France, obviously. He was noted as the first Corsican student to graduate and enter in the service of the French army as a humble artillery officer. Kidding! He was never humble. It's important to mention that here that at the time, French society was structured in a way that was deeply hierarchical, and class warfare sentiments were already brimming. The French Revolution would officially begin 4 years later, but the sentiments that had led to French peasantry to revolt, namely the fact that the wealthy were not being taxed enough to fund repeated war efforts, were already coming to a head. It's in the midst of this deeply classist mindset that young Napoleon started his military career. The rank of artillery officer was by no means glamorous or coveted. The position required knowledge and skills, two things that the nobility thought of as below them. This is because being aware of minutiae was essentially the job of the poor, whereas people in positions of power didn't bother with such details. As such, it wouldn't do for a man such as Napoleon to be relegated to this position for life. Napoleon, as it was, refused to ever be condemned to a life of mediocrity. Napoleon was a young man with a very high opinion of himself. This personal view is something that would be need to be fed by external validation. By 1789, the French Revolution was brewing and tensions were rising between France and Corsica. Napoleon took this opportunity and left his position in the French army, making a return to his homeland. He was intent on pursuing a course to greatness regardless of allegiance. Let's take a moment to highlight this because it's a personality trait that informs his future endeavors pretty severely. Napoleon is more interested in his personal glory as opposed to any idealism or loyalty. Now, back to our story. His first foray into personal greatness led to him to participate in many military uprisings in Corsica, establishing himself as a fervent Corsican nationalist. It also led him to seek out one of his personal idols, the leader of the Corsican independence, Pascal Paoli, a man who he admired greatly. In Napoleon's mind, he thought, might as well back this guy, and chances are glory will be mine in some form or another. But Napoleon's relationship with Pascal Paoli was growing increasingly unstable. Paoli, who was considered the father of Corsican nationalism, was a man who still operated under the Corsican clan mentality, and Paoli believed that the Bonapartes were traitors who allied themselves with the French occupiers, which, not wrong, but Paoli did not factor in any form of societal survival, which most likely fell into the Napoleon family's desire to fold within the French when they took over. For him, traitor was a traitor, and he let it be known. What's more, Napoleon himself was increasingly espousing beliefs that allied themselves with French revolutionary ideas. During a French attack in Sardinia, Napoleon received confusing orders from an officer who was appointed by Paoli. This caused Napoleon to retreat from battle and abandon precious cannons on the battlefield. As a result, French were successful in their attack. The Bonapartes suffered political persecution as a result, which caused their home to be burned down, forcing them to relocate to mainland France. This episode was formative for Napoleon. Paoli's inability to accept him and the immediate retaliation on the Bonapartes for reasons that he deemed unjust. It is after this that he officially changed his birth name from Napoleon de Bonaparte to the French-sounding Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1792, the French Revolution was in full swing. There was a lot of turmoil, lots of fighting, and a whole society, was in upheave. As mentioned earlier, the focus of the revolution was to upend and rewrite the relationships between people in power and the folks in the lower echelons of society. And a theme all too common in history, in the West, destroying unequal power dynamics should be only achieved through means of violence, vigilantism, general instability. In Europe, Prussia, Britain, and Italy were all at war with France. As for France itself, it was in the process of upending its monarchical structures, meaning civil war was raging between different political factions. It was in this very climate that Napoleon first slid back onto the military scene in France. First, he helped the government take on some rebels in the south of France, but his allegiance was precarious and conditional, and soon he would turn to new opportunities. In 1793, the Jacobins, I think it's Jacobins, right? Yeah, Jacobins. Just kidding. I did look up a pronunciation for that. I just wanted to be silly. A faction of French Republicans vying for power at the crux of the French Revolution set their sights on the port city of Toulon. As a sidebar, the Jacobins were a particularly violent leftist faction that cultivated an aura of ruthlessness during the revolutionary period. They were quick to dispatch their enemies in their bid for control, that's for sure. So much so that their period of political ascendancy was called the Reign of Terror, which is terrifying, I suppose. So perhaps it's because of their open callousness or the fact that they were gaining some net advantage that Napoleon sought his chance at allyship. The leader of the Jacobins, Maximilien Robespierre, who is known as being a controversial and iconic historical person, his mottos of equality, liberty, and fraternity would not match up with the literal reign of terror that he provoked in the streets of Paris and all throughout France. Pendulum swung too far, as it were, and the radical nature of his propositions fueled extremism in the form of executions, persecutions, and the general assassination of his opponents. The Jacobin Party took control of the Committee of Public Safety and in turn caused mass unsafety for the public, it turns out. Weird, isn't it ironic? In July of 1793, Napoleon took it upon himself to write a pro-Republican pamphlet, which is basically the historical equivalent of a tweet or an X, whatever is going on there. This pamphlet defended the ideas of the revolution and got the attention and support of Augustin Robespierre, who was, you guessed it, the brother of the leader of the revolution. Anyway, back to Toulon. Toulon was a port city in southern France's Mediterranean coast. Historically, it was a place that always carried significant French naval presence. At the time that Toulon got into the crosshairs of the Jacobins, it was full of French royalists that were in turn supported by Anglo-Spanish forces. This conflict actually marks the first time that the French fought with the British Royal Navy. Our boy Napoleon, ever the opportunist, and who was still just an artillery officer at the time, took advantage of the fact that the chief of artillery, Elzier Augustin Cousin d'Aumatern, wow, what a mouthful that was wounded and ingratiated himself upon the whole situation with the help of some well-positioned friends, such as, Augustin Robespierre. In short, he cashed in on his little pamphlet stunt. So, to recap, Napoleon's superior, who hated Napoleon, by the way, was out of commission. Napoleon saw an opportunity. He got his buddies to sneak him to the core of action and even propelling him to the helm. He was appointed by a senior gunner and artillery commander of the Republican forces that arrived in Toulon on September 8th, 1793. The biggest day in history. What's up? Now, let's just be reminded that it's not to say that Napoleon got to such historical great heights due to his cunningness and connections alone. He was, of course, a good military strategist. The siege of Toulon, in fact, would be the first notable example of his military prowess. Napoleon's plan was to capture a hill that would serve as a vantage point. From there, the Republican gunmen would be able to mow down any opponents in the city's harbor. Napoleon's plan ultimately succeeded, which meant that he gained some notoriety and was promoted to the position of brigadier at the tender age of 24, which is pretty impressive. Now, do you remember when I said that Napoleon is basically in it for Napoleon and no one else? Well, in 1794, we would see the steady rise against the Jacobin party start to form, which would ultimately culminate in the stomping out of the revolutionary fever. This may have something to do with the fact that by this point, the Jacobins had killed at least 40,000 people that disagreed with them, many of them by way of mass public executions, which is a good way to get your message across. As it were, regimes came and went in the quick succession in Paris at the time. Napoleon, perhaps sensing the imminent downfall of his friends, the people who had given him a leg up in certain circles, power, saw his rise to power by allegiance momentarily halted. A new regime had began to coalesce as the royalist uprising fermented. The period of quick change that ensued is called the Thermidorian reaction. Named after the month in which the coup was held, Thermidor, the 11th month of the French Republican calendar, in case you were curious. In one foul swoop, a coup ousted Robespierre and his head. Basically, the period of turmoil engineered by the left, economic popularism, de-Christianizing, and harsh military moves meant that the populace leaned towards wanting any type of stability. As such, this desire was capitalized on to push out Robespierre. But the Thermidor succession was no better. Pendulums simply swung from radicalism to reactionism, with staunch measures put in place that would assure the opposition would be limited. As prisons were emptied and social lives became more free, there was an uptick in over-opulence and personal and political corruption, set in the diametric opposition to, once again, a suffering lower class that was still reeling from civil unrest. What came out of this was a group called the Directory, an association of representatives that were part of the surviving bourgeoisie, and this fact is important as the surviving bourgeoisie can be characterized as kind of revolutionary exploiters who stepped out of the reign of terror more or less exalted to have survived. The post-terror climate was one for the lucky members of society, marked by extreme frivolity. Even the fashion was loose, with women wearing no bras. Crazy. Many privileged folks would simply lounge around in salons all day long, where decadent food was passed around and music played. It was in this specific vignette of time that Napoleon would meet his future wife. In 1795, Napoleon met Josephine de Beauharnais, who was 5 years older than him at the time. All right, into the older ladies. And has, already been married with 2 children. Josephine had legally been separated from her husband, Alexander de Beauharnais, by court order sometime before. The latter was executed in 1794 during the Reign of Terror. Josephine, for her part, was imprisoned during that period and subsequently freed when Robespierre was executed and his regime fell. Josephine, a charming, beautiful woman who was also connected to the higher echelons of society. She was a lady of the salon, meaning that, she spent her days schmoozing, basically. When Napoleon met her, they fell madly in love and began a passionate affair. On March 5th, 1796, they married. Napoleon's family was none too pleased with this marriage, as Josephine was technically a widow with 2 children to boot. Not a good look, I guess, for the, I don't know. It's an old-timey thing. They're like, you can't marry a widow. She shouldn't be allowed to love ever again. Apparently, they're not allowed to love more than once in their life. Anyway, 2 days after Napoleon and Josephine married, he was sent to lead the French army in Italy. What a honeymoon. Napoleon was given the position of commanding general of the army of Italy. It was worth mentioning here that Napoleon was often noted as being a superstitious man, one who believed that some people were born inherently lucky in life. He was reported to always seeking out a lucky star amid his various campaigns. For him, it can be contrived as his concept of destiny as well. Napoleon undoubtedly thought that he was destined for greatness. For his tour in Italy, Napoleon sought the guise of a lucky star in his new life, kept a small portrait of her with him at all times. He's a little romantic, this guy. When Napoleon arrived in Italy, the French forces that were stationed there had been highly neglected, and so the terrain was ripe for Napoleon to, rouse the troops with an impactful speech. As such, he targeted their specific woes, no doubt, but also betrayed a little bit of his overall intention. Here we get all that glory for you, glory for us, glory for me type of diatribe, as well as the highest of incentives, honor, glory, and wealth, for the money, the fame, but mostly for the money, you know what I'm saying? The campaign on Italy is a good little vignette illustrating the type of warfare that will be historically known as Napoleonic warfare. It was almost piratical in its swiftness, with a type of plunder and subdued backbone to it. At the time, Italy was occupied by the Austrian Empire, whose army was formidable. To counter them, Napoleon acted in a way that would, be distinctly him. He got on the offensive quickly and unexpectedly. See, Napoleon was lucky enough to have a great eye for geographical detail and, could take in the scenery and figure out how to cut off the enemy best. The signature move would be making it so that the enemy could not retreat or restock and have to face the French forces, sometimes woefully unprepared. So, in sum, Napoleonic warfare is mainly characterized as being one of rapid movement. In 1797, under such a barrage, the Austrians threw in the towel. Napoleon had his first victory as general, which I'm sure was just fine for his ego, thanks for asking. So here's the thing though, jokes aside, Napoleon was a good battlefield leader. However, as we mentioned before, it's never enough for our boy. So, on top of being a good military leader, Napoleon had designs on being a political leader as well. One could even say that he felt entitled to political clout, as the kids say. Some may say that he had the entitlement of the monarch. Crazy. Who would think that about Napoleon? So, This humble, pious little Napoleon? Not him. Napoleon is documented as having expressed admiration for some of history's greatest military leaders, like Hannibal, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great. Hannibal not being the Silence of the Lambs Hannibal, but, the Roman, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, all those guys probably be good to cover at some point, but not today. He did adopt and fine-tune some of their military tactics, especially from Alexander, who was one of his favorites. One of his signature moves was the pincer movement, engaging both flanks of an enemy formation with his troops while moving his artillery to support the infantry. In just over a year, Napoleon became a national hero to the French people. He had conquered most of northern Italy and the Netherlands. He also sacked and robbed the Italian nobility and sent countless riches and art back to France, further boosting his exploits from afar. The steady stream of treasures was an outward demonstration of his success and cemented his reputation as an effective campaigner. Hey, look at all these cool things I'm sending you. Isn't this great? Wouldn't you like this to continue? Vote Napoleon. Vote for Pedro. Now, it is important to note that with every meteoric rise to power comes the inevitable scrutiny that follows. Some French monarchists decried Napoleon's plundering of Italy, condemning it as a warning sign of his underlying intent, overall pompousness. Some folks literally said that he might become a dictator, and I say nay, not Napoleon. He is humble and kind. Anyway, in September of 1797, Napoleon sent some of his troops in support of a coup d'etat upheld by the French Directory. These members overturned election results from months prior, which were in favor of a return to a monarchist regime. As such, the monarchists were ousted from the legislature, and Napoleon's main critics at the time faded from political relevancy. Big move. Super humble, obviously. However, even members of the Directory had some queasiness about his quick ascension to power. In a bid to prevent any further, improvement of his status, he was sent as far away as possible, sent by the Directory to Egypt. Thus, in 1798, Napoleon turned his gaze upon France's greatest enemy, the British, which means, of course, that he set his sights onto Egypt, because there's nothing more British than Egypt, especially if you look at their museums. As part of France's long-term strategic thinking aimed at ending British stalemate in Levant, an area broadly analogous to the Middle East. One of Napoleon's strong suits, which we already kind of saw in his earlier power plays, was his ability to use networks of influence and, publicity campaigns to his advantage. Let's not forget that his personal glory always informed his decisions. In his Egyptian campaigns, Napoleon hoped to explore the idea of Egypt as a source of economic power and a way to move the French east, disrupt Britain's success to India. By doing so, Britain would be cut off from products and resources. Napoleon's strategy in Egypt betrays his underlying capacity for manipulating a situation for his gains. What's more, his stay in Egypt will solidify his love of ruling and his capacity for violence. Before departing for Egypt, Napoleon was made a member of the Academy of Sciences, for which he would be later elected as leader in 1801 for his contributions during the Egyptian campaign. As such, he did not only bring soldiers into Egypt, but he also brought a team of 167 scholars and scientists, including mathematicians, naturalists, and chemists, and established a study of what is essentially known today as Egyptology. These folks traveled with the campaigning soldiers, collected artifacts, quote-unquote, for future studying. One notable example is, of course, the taking of the Rosetta Stone, the ancient tablet with the inscription of a decree written in the Ptolemaic dynasties. This stone was instrumental in deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs. It is important to note that by collected, I did mean steal. But the campaign, again, wasn't a purely academic endeavor. Napoleon would also plan to steal Egypt's many riches in the form of artifacts. His eventual occupation of Egypt was characterized by deception. French republicanism and his anti-Catholic stance was mistakenly, or perhaps the right word is deceivingly, inferred to as being pro-Islam. What's more, Napoleon lied by declaring himself a worshipper of Islam, allegedly. This also highlights his ability to flip-flop without any true allegiance other than to himself. The occupation of Egypt highlights some of the characteristics of what would later be termed Napoleonic occupation: looting, requisition, theft, physical abuse. He also found himself comfortable with ruling because in Egypt he set himself up in a whole pavilion. In this lavish space, he would adorn himself with the most luxurious garbs of the area, gave gifts to the populace, and cast himself as the liberator of the people. This is very relevant as it kind of shows his true colors. This is where he was like allowed to truly be how he wanted without any kind of external forces telling him otherwise. It also is a bit of an indication of things to come. It should be noted here that in another manipulative tactic, the overt opulence and display of domination that he cultivated while on Egyptian soil was shed when he eventually returned to France. It's like he tried on the suit of a ruler and, shall we say, got the taste for it a little bit. You're gonna like the way you look. The conquest of Egypt culminated in the Battle of the Nile, where the French fleet fought the British Royal Navy once more. Battle of the Nile is considered one of the more decisive confrontations of the Age of Sail, which we kind of learned about a little bit in the pirate episodes, but you know, that's what they called it. There's all the giant sailboats with cannons. It was a good time, with the British ultimately winning. Little side note here. Do you remember in the very first episode when I talked about the Total War games that led me to pick the War Dogs episode? Well, there's also a Total War game about Napoleon, about the boy, and I played that one. And guess what? You get to do the Egyptian campaign, and I gotta tell you, if that game's any indicator, Napoleon was insanely good at just dominating everybody, because that's what I did when I played it. I'm sure that's pretty realistic, but anyway, back to the Battle of the Nile, which was fought on August 1st, 1798, and pitted the British fleet under Admiral Horatio Nelson with Napoleon's fleet. Napoleon was fresh from victory in Malta, and perhaps feeling a little cocky. His forces awaited the arriving British fleet in what they thought was a secure position, but Nelson arrived near nightfall and attacked immediately. In a key move, several of Nelson's ships were able to penetrate the French line and wreak havoc, with some even getting behind the French fleet. Not a good move. Ultimately, the battle was fierce. The British emerged victorious. It was a deadly battle as well, the French losing between 2,000 and 5,000 men, with over 9,000 being captured. As for the British, it is reported that they only lost 218 men, and that 617 flip-flopped them. 617 were injured. Napoleon, however, did not leave the area immediately upon defeat. He marched his troops into the Ottoman province of Damascus in Syria. Interestingly, this is where the elements of his brutality of Napoleon's personality, kind of emerged. He is reported to have ordered the execution of 1,400 Ottoman prisoners at Haifa, but some sources say it could be up to 4,000 people. They were mostly executed by bayonet, however some died in drowning or bladed weapons in order to save bullets. This event marks Napoleon's capacity for violence, and news of it trickled back to France. Not good. This is very interesting because there's a lot of propaganda resulting from the Syrian campaign. For instance, Napoleon is reported as being benevolent towards plague-stricken soldiers in the city of Haifa and even curing them. There are even paintings depicting Napoleon extending his reach towards plague victims, inferring some sort of supernatural quality to his being, like he's able to perform miracles like a Jesus type character. Rumors about his ability to not only touch but heal plague victims circulated at the time, giving him a supernatural aura. This kind of highlights another aspect there is to Napoleon. It's never enough. He can't just be good at something. He has to be downright heavenly, and he's not above letting the rumor mill spill beneficial gossip and manipulate it to his advantage. In fact, the fact that he visited plague-stricken soldiers being underlined serves as a reminder that there's probably an attempt somewhere down the line to quell the news of some of the atrocities that were committed at Haifa. There was even a rumor circulated that after visiting the plague-stricken soldiers in Haifa, Napoleon ordered them to be poisoned by opium because he did not want to have to wait around for them to die. This is not something that is generally agreed upon by historians, but interesting to note. Ultimately, Napoleon failed to defeat the British and the British-backed Ottoman soldiers in Egypt, so he decided to return to Paris in 1799, but it was not under any direct orders. He simply just peaced out on his own, effectively leaving a whole army behind, which was an offense punishable by death under the Revolution. His Egyptian campaign had abjectly failed, but no one in France knew it at the time. Remember, the man cultivated an aura for himself, and his exploits was all carefully crafted. When he returned to France, it was in his traditional soldier's garb. Thus, he was parading himself as a humble soldier of the people and was given a hero's welcome. It looks like Napoleon engendered himself enough propaganda to hide the fact that he had lost the great battle, and perhaps had even taken out his frustrations on prisoners and sick soldiers in his own troop. One thing that is for sure, Napoleon left Egypt with a sense of what he was, capable of doing, both in his inward capacity for violence to achieve by any means, and his ease of rule. When Napoleon returned to France, it was at an auspicious time. The political situation was dire, as now France, under the corrupt five-person directory, was facing a new coalition of enemies, the British and the Holy Roman Empire. This war was dubbed the War of the Second Coalition, and the economic situation of France was struggling as a result because war is expensive. Sensing that a regime change was in order, Napoleon made the boldest move of his life, one that would actually change the course of history. However, Napoleon believed that he was destined for this role. He staged a coup d'etat on November 9th, 1799, overthrowing the Directory and imposing a new authoritarian solution. The coup, called the Coup of 18 Brumaire, is considered by some historians to be the official end of the French Revolution. It was orchestrated by Napoleon and his brother Lucien, who was the president of the Council of 500, or the lower house of legislature, as well as Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, the chief political theorist of the French Revolution. The coup had a janky start, as it is said that Napoleon, not being a good public speaker, could not get his voice across the shouts and yells coming from the legislature. To remedy this, he called in his army that was waiting outside and using it to dissolve the legislature, which is pretty intense. Napoleon and his allies formed a new political regime called the Consulate. He was elected and took power under the title of First Consul. He was now the head of the French First Republic. The position of First Consul awarded himself almost ultimate power. In order to cement his newfound power, Napoleon drafted a constitution which was signed in a fraudulent vote that stated that 99% of the votes had been cast in favor of Napoleon retaining this position. The first task that he undertook was reestablishing bonds between the state and the Catholic Church. Napoleon believed that the country should have a religion, it just didn't matter which one. As we said before, he toyed with Islam when he was in Egypt. For France, he surmised that mending ties with the Catholic Church would serve his purposes. In 1801, he agreed to a concordat with the papacy, which officially recognized Catholicism as the official religion of France. There's a bit of a trade at play here, however, because this concordat was somewhat conditional. Among other minutiae, the state would pay clergymen's salary as long as they upheld the current French government. This assured that the support of a very important institution. So basically, listen, we're going to pay your salary of all your priests, but make sure they're in there talking about how great Napoleon and team, Napoleon and Co., Napoleon Inc. is doing. It's important to note here that France at this point was ripe for change, and that, most notably, Napoleon had a lot of public support. This was most likely due to the persistent lack of stability created by decades of economic disruption, war, and regime changes. In cases like these, we'll find out, it seems like the populace gravitates towards openly authoritarian regimes as a trade-off for stability and security. So during his time in Egypt, France had lost most of the territories that Napoleon had gained, notably Italy and the county of Nice. In order to bolster his position as first consul, Napoleon decided to retake northern Italy by taking a page out of Hannibal's book, using an unexpected route that took his troops through the Great St. Bernard Pass, passing so many gigantic dogs. In the Swiss Alps. Hannibal, of course, famous for taking the elephants through the Alps into Italy. Napoleon was able to surprise his enemy. In fact, his army was kind of coalesced out of nowhere, appearing behind Austrian forces that were fighting in Genoa. On June 14th, 1800, the Battle of Marengo raged. Napoleon led 24,000 soldiers against 30,000 Austrians. Ultimately, the French lines held, and the Austrians lost this surprise attack. It's said that Napoleon himself constantly rode in between the rows of his soldiers, boosting their morale himself. His victory gave the French control over Po Valley. In December of that year, the French defeated the Austrians in Germany as well, forcing the Austrians to sign the Treaty of Luneville and consolidated Napoleon's position as first consul in Paris. Britain remained the sole great enemy of France, but the two forces were at a stalemate. What's more, Britain had no more continental allies. Another salient win for Napoleon was the temporary cessation of hostility under the Treaty of Amiens, signed on March 25, 1802 between France and the United Kingdom, which effectively put an end to the French Revolutionary Wars. This ushered in a brief period of peace, and the economy began to rebound, causing Napoleon to have a period of great approval. However, some dissidents still remained. In fact, an assassination plot was discovered, one that Napoleon claimed was spearheaded by the heir of the previously reigning Bourbon family. And no, not that Bourbon, although that would be cool. the heir, the Duke of Enghien, not confident with that one, was unceremoniously executed. That's what he gets for having a confusing last name. This execution shocked the French aristocracy and seemed to awaken the dormant sentiment that Napoleon had the designs of a dictator. It is an event that is sometimes credited by historians as the origin point of what would later become the Napoleonic Wars. Many royal families in Europe saw this act as an ill omen of Napoleon's ultimate intention. In 1802, people were urged to thank Napoleon for bringing peace, sort of gift to the people. As such, a referendum was put in place asking, should Napoleon be the first consul for life? Question mark. This referendum was overwhelmingly supportive, but its legitimacy, such as that of the vote earlier that got him, the first consul in the first place, has historically been put into question. Regardless, Napoleon had himself declared consul for life, which it turns out was a huge red flag, because on December 2nd, 1804, in a classic Napoleon move, Napoleon literally crowned himself Emperor of France under the name Napoleon I, or Napoleon I, effectively creating a military dictatorship. That's right, he actually placed the crown on his own head. He marched into the coronation room wearing a circlet of laurels and reminiscent of the Roman era, and was crowned with the crown of Charlemagne, which is specifically made for this event. Charlemagne, I should mention, was a medieval monarch who was the king of Franks and the Holy Roman Emperor. This is actually pretty significant for many reasons, the first of which is that its self-aggrandizing propagandistic tone and choice that showed the world that Napoleon, this is how he viewed himself. The second was that the whole scene was in contrast to the time Charlemagne himself was crowned by Pope Leo III in 800 CE. Napoleon effectively crowning himself meant that he owed his legitimacy to no one, especially not to the Catholic Church, whereas Charlemagne needed the Pope to go, you're the king now, man. Napoleon justified this dictatorship by stating it was simply a return to the good old days of the Roman Empire. This created a hereditary system, assuring a clear line of succession for the Bonaparte family. It also fed into the logical line of action espoused by the noblemen of the time, who were all well versed in the classics. The natural evolution of this time of political upheaval was the crowning of an emperor, right? So, to recap, in only 10 years, our boy Napoleon went from being an unknown artillery officer to the emperor of the largest empire Europe had seen in like 1,000 years, and this highlights the fact that Napoleon was highly ambitious, very intelligent, and sought untold amounts of power. As part of his rule, he forwarded the idea of working legal and judicial systems by codifying the law, centralizing the judicial system in Paris. The Napoleonic Code was more conservative, it reasserted patriarchal systems, and did away with progressive ideas for the times like abolitionism and equal rights for women. Those things you definitely don't need. Just kidding, in case that was not obvious. In fact, the status of women was noticeably reduced during Napoleon's reign. Their civil rights were more or less stripped away, with all decision power over their lives being handed to their fathers or husbands. Napoleon also ushered in a public school system based on the ideals of reasoning and intelligent debate. So, a little bit of a not so good, a little bit of a good. Napoleon did not want to limit his rule to France. Let's not forget, the man idolized Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. As such, he aimed for territorial expansion of all Europe, as well as British Isles too. To do so, he drafted a huge army of young men aged between 20 and 24 years old. Perhaps here we can also glean the reason as to why Napoleon was favored by his soldiers, as he did fight alongside his men in over 60 battles, gaining military victory after military victory. The ideal espoused was conquest without limit, a perfect metaphor for the man who could never have enough. Napoleon would conquer territories like Austria and Germany, and have the men of those territories join his army, constantly beefing up his numbers. By 1806, he effectively dissolved the Holy Roman Empire after defeating Austria and Russia in several battles, culminating in the Battle of Austerlitz. Napoleon ushered forth some standardization in the conquered territories. He unified Europe by ending serfdom, legislating religious tolerance, and creating schools for scientific and technological study. He also created the Confederation of the Rhine, which unified German states. He imposed the Napoleonic Code as discussed previously, as well as the metric system. All of these actions, standardization, more or less served to somewhat unify Europe at the time, which you can kind of look at as he's doing this as really building a massive empire. He wasn't going, hey man, I'm gonna conquer this and then you're gonna keep running it. He was this is the system we're going to run. You're all going to learn it. And this whole thing is going to be great. And I kind of wonder while reading this, if this isn't like the underplaying of like the European Union now. Like, did he kind of lay the building blocks? I don't know. Anyway, should also be mentioned here that Napoleon, who often referred to his wife as Josephine as his lucky star, who wrote her poems on the battlefield, had since been faced with a conundrum. Josephine, as it transpired, was unable to produce an heir, and this, of course, meant, problematic for an emperor hell-bent on creating a dynasty. As such, he was forced to divorce Josephine. Naturally, originally, Napoleon sought out the youngest sister of Tsar Alexander I, Anna Pavlovna. This was in hopes of legitimizing his empire by marrying into one of the leading royal families in Europe. However, an Austrian union was pushed, and ultimately he married Marie-Louise, Duchess of Parma, by proxy on March 11th, 1810. It's important to note that the marriage was conducted solely for political reasons. Marriage did produce a son, of course, who was named, naturally, Napoleon. During this period, Napoleon also reinstated the aristocracy in France, handed out titles to his friends and family, which caused quite a bit of problems for him down the line. Napoleon's janky mastery of Europe created a fair bit of nationalism on behalf of his conquered territories. This is due in part because he was in the habit of generally putting one of his bros, and this is quite literal, he put his brothers in position of power in pseudo-monarchical positions over his conquered territories. Instead of his new subjects viewing themselves as French, they dug their heels and retained a sense of ardent nationalism. For example, during this period, Spain proved to be a thorn in Napoleon's side as a resisted occupation. The conflict that resulted was the single most destructive event in Napoleonic wars and would contribute to Napoleon's eventual demise. In order to push back against Britain's constant opposition, Napoleon sought to attack their economy. By forcing other European nations to close their ports to Britain, he would attempt to cripple them financially. Portugal refused to do so and continued to trade with Britain, which is a total Portuguese move if I've ever seen one. No, I'm just kidding. If you don't understand that point of contention against the Portuguese, listen to the pirate episodes. You'll learn something. Their continued trade with Britain caused the French army to occupy Lisbon in 1807. Then Napoleon sought to control over Spain. In May of 1808, he invaded Spain and occupied Madrid. In a move that would prove costly, Napoleon deposed the ruler of Spain, King Charles IV, and placed his own brother, Joseph, on the throne. This caused a massive uproar and started a 6-year rebellion. The Spanish held open and active disdain for the French conquerors, who have been depicted as being barbaric. The conflict was the result of a severe miscalculation on Napoleon's part, to the point that it was sometimes dubbed the Spanish ulcer. Officially, the French army would engage Spain and Portugal in what was called the Peninsular War, which were fought in the Iberian Peninsula, which would last from 1808 to 1814. Casualties of the Peninsular War were staggering. Some sources placed the French casualties at 180 to 240,000, with 91,000 soldiers killed in action, whereas the Spanish side would feel the loss of upwards of 580,000 people, with 300,000 of those deaths being classified as military deaths. Ultimately, with the help of the British, Spain and Portugal were able to fight off the French forces away from the Iberian Peninsula. This was a crushing blow to Napoleon's plan of unending territorial conquest. Another big moment in his bid for global domination, Napoleon set his sights on the conquering of Russia. He amassed an army of up to 700,000 men from all across his territories and began the invasion in June of 1812. As the campaign marched on extended periods of time, they began to grow weary from the exhaustion. The Russians, for their part, counteracted steadily by retreating, but in doing so also burned and destroyed all resources that they could be used, which, food, shelter, cattle, wood, all these things. This tactic, which you may have heard of, is called a scorched earth tactic. The campaign ultimately reached its apex with the Battle of Borodino, where the French narrowly won but lost 30,000 soldiers. Now, the army was far away from home and in the depths of Russia territory. I don't know if you guys know this, but Russia has some pretty harsh winters. So, as the seasons changed and the temperature dipped, so did supplies. One of the surviving men in Napoleon's army, the ones who had come from conquered lands, opted to dip out, which I get it. They were less loyal than the actual French ones. The remaining 100,000 or so soldiers marched on to Moscow, only to find the city burning and once again resources scarce. This did not initially discourage Napoleon, who originally planned to wait for Tsar Alexander I's surrender. Now Alexander refused to surrender or agree to terms, and what I'm sure is a truly crushing defeat, Napoleon marched his troops onto nearby Poland. Defeated and starving, by the time they reached the border in 1813, their numbers shrunk to 40,000, which is harrowing. 700,000 to 40,000. So, Napoleon, returning from Russia with a depleted force, was not a good look, and some European forces took note. This is why Napoleon's mastery over Europe was rather short-lived as far as empires go. As it were, Russia, Austria, Sweden, Prussia formed a coalition which was happily financially backed by the British, and this coalition numbered some 320,000 men. Napoleon, for his part, replenished his ranks with new inexperienced recruits, garnering a total of 180,000 souls. On October 16, 1813, coalition forces attacked the French near Leipzig, Germany, in the Kingdom of Saxony. The first day was considered a draw. Some key French positions were seized, but the French held off. On the second day, the French attempted an unsuccessful counterattack as new coalition reinforcements joined the ranks. By the fourth day, the coalition was in hot pursuit of the retreating French force. In a disastrous turn of events, one of Napoleon's generals failed to destroy a bridge over the Elster River. This blunder ultimately caused the death of many Frenchmen and the capture of 30,000 French soldiers. In 1813, the coalition defeated French forces at Leipzig in what is known as the Battle of the Nations. This marked the beginning of the end of Napoleon's reign. Napoleon waged this battle as opposed to yielding to the coalition's terms, which would have kept him in as France's ruler, which is, little just emblematic of his nature in general. So, having lost, he had to abdicate his throne under the Treaty of Fontainebleau. I don't know. That's been so long since I took French class, I can't pronounce anything. Following this, he went into exile on the island of Elba, a Mediterranean island off the coast of Italy, which he was allowed to rule over this island while his wife, Marie Louise, and their son Napoleon lived in Austria. The end. Nope. Just kidding. In 1815, a year after his first exile, Napoleon escaped Elba and sailed to France with 1,000 of his supporters and 4 guns. Big time. On March 20th of that year, he returned to France, landing in Cannes. As he marched through rural areas heading to Paris, he was accosted by cheering crowds of peasantry. The new king, Louis XVII, had already made a hasty exit before Napoleon even touched the shore. In preparation for Napoleon's arrival, the alliance of British, Prussian, Russian, and Austrians vowed to maintain 150,000 men in the field until Napoleon was overthrown. Shortly after, it was decided that the Allied armies would muster up 794,000 troops and march on Paris to thwart Napoleon. Because Russia would take a while to join the fray, the invasion was pushed to July. This allowed Napoleon to build up his defenses. He had 160,000 men at his disposal, and would have been able to muster up more had mandatory conscription not been abolished. By summoning undischarged men, he was able to amass 80,000 extra souls. In order to confront the coalition of the time, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Britain, his idea was decidedly Napoleonic. He wanted to strike quickly, preventing the forces from acting as a united front. Pretty good plan. In June of 1815, Napoleon invaded Belgium, intent on attacking British and Prussian troops. The Prussian troops were defeated at the Battle of Ligny on June 15th, 1815. The Allied forces numbering 68,000 Belgian, German, and Dutch soldiers were led by General Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington, with an additional 45,000 Prussians under Gerhard Lebrecht von Blücher. That's not even a real name. Added to the fold, ultimately contributing to Napoleon's defeat. The battle was fought near the town of Waterloo, 9 miles south of Brussels, Belgium, and would prove to be Napoleon's last stand on the battlefield. He fought alongside 72,000 of his men. Napoleon made a crucial error on this day. Because there was rainfall the night before, Napoleon judged that waiting for the waterlogged ground to dry was the best course of action. Because of this, he only ordered the attack to move forward around midday, and because of that delay, 30,000 Prussians had time to join the fray. Didn't mean to rhyme, but you're welcome. Napoleon's troops fought valiantly, but the Duke's forces were very well positioned, being behind and along a ridge top. By the time Prussians joined the battle in the afternoon, the French demise was all but assured. The French suffered around 40,000 casualties, meaning dead, wounded, or taken prisoners, while the Prussians and British numbered around 22,000. However, altogether, the French suffered upwards of 10,800 deaths in the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's forces were finally crushed by the British, and he surrendered for the last time at the Battle of Waterloo. Stories have been stated that Napoleon left the battlefield in tears. This ended the 23-year recurring warfare between France and other European nations. For his final exile, Napoleon spent the rest of his life on a British-occupied island of St. Helena, where he ultimately died at the age of 52. It's said that he died of stomach cancer, although some folks, surmise that he was poisoned. Legend has it that his final whispered word was Josephine. And he died at 51. His last battle, like I said, June of 1815, he died in 1821. Just to put that in perspective of, how much time he spent on that island after he was exiled. Napoleon was undoubtedly a complex character. Modern interpretations of his exploits and personality place him as someone who was incapable of settling for mediocrity and believed in himself to be destined for greatness. Although he was very cozy with the idea of ultimate rule and used a lot of manipulative tactics and violence to get there, a view of him as one of the greats still persists to this day. He did, of course, bring about certain changes to the European social and educational landscape that cannot be discredited, but he also, had noted disdain for the masses. With that, let's move into the fun facts we learned about Napoleon today. Was someone who was so embroiled by myths and propaganda, it is nice to have everything laid out in this kind of fashion. The biggest, ironically, is his size. As mentioned, in addition to the English propaganda, it just very well could have boiled down to a difference in measuring techniques by the British and the French. People give the US crap for using scales like, how many bananas tall is that? But countries right next to each other were off by like half a foot in some cases, which is kind of hilarious to me. Kind of leads me into the next one where Napoleon syndrome or short man syndrome is misattributed, or maybe not misattributed, but maybe it is. I believe it is a thing, obviously, but Napoleon was a little different than that. Like, it makes more sense that being bullied as a child would create a mentality that would lead him to feel like nothing was ever enough for him. Maybe it really is short man syndrome and what it stands for, just men who are short and feel, this inferiority complex about it from, being bullied as children and trying to make up for it as adults. Also, how wild was it that he got kicked out and given an island in a lovely area off the coast of Italy, and he was like, nah, going back in. Go stop right now and Google pictures of Elba. Like, it is insane. It's gorgeous. And they're like, you can rule this island, man. This is your kingdom, this island, you got it. And he said, no, I need more. I'm going. This is the same passion as the thing that prevented him from being emperor for a long time. Always wanting more, always needing to prove something, and thus, always to tyrants. And I said that, I wrote that in there because I thought it sounded cool, but really Napoleon was overthrown due to his inability to be satisfied after, accomplishment. He made these, big conquests, and then he's like, I gotta go further, and they're like, we're cutting you off. Like, you're done. And he was accomplished. I read this article about mathematically how Napoleon was so effective as a general in his troops' victories. Like, if you compare all the battles that happened at the time when he was, in the field somewhere, and all the battles where he was technically emperor, or, he was in charge of the country, but not at those battles, like, statistically, he's great. He's a great general. And having been physically in over 80 battles, and I think only losing 11 of them, that's pretty impressive. Honestly, the whole Russian thing is kind of wild. Like, looking at it's so abstractly, like, removed from the situation, and you go, why did he just keep going? And it's nothing short of, like, just determination to make yourself into this, massive power. Like, that's all it was. Like, he wanted a bigger name, he wanted to go big, go for broke, try to do whatever you can to make this happen, and that ultimately was his downfall, just trying too much. Same thing with coming back in. Like, he rushed Belgium when he didn't need to. He could have hunkered down in France and, picked off people in different ways, but he was like, no, I gotta do it. I gotta go now. And it worked in a lot of ways, but then also he drove himself off a cliff a couple different ways. He just kept going, and I think that's something, I will always really think about, how intense of a personality he would have had to do some of the things that he did. But I'd love to hear your favorite parts of this, your thoughts on this or any episode. Go ahead, go to the Facebook, share them in the Facebook page. There's a Facebook group now, which is just Remedial Scholar Podcast. You could go there. You can communicate with other people who listen to the podcast, share history stuff, share memes, all the things. But that's it for Napoleon. Man had an intense drive, to say the least. Thank you again for listening. Thank you to those who support me. I appreciate it so much. Thank you to the people who have given me, some topic suggestions. I would love to have more. If you have one, send an email to remedialscholar@gmail.com or post it in the Facebook page or group. Next week, going to be a fun one, Salem witch trials. Get into some more witch talk. Bit more focused on them than the little bit I mentioned last week with Joan and the English. Still very intense, very interesting. Going to be discussing all of the possible scenarios that could, explain the actions that led to the deaths of 19 people in the community of 17th century Massachusetts. One of the more fascinating parts of early settlement history, and I am excited to bring it all to you next week. Please check out all the links, share us everywhere, and I will see you next time. Bye!